Hello, and welcome to this episode of Novel Approaches for the London Review of Books. I'm Clare Bucknell, and I'm a Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and a contributor to the paper. And today, for the first time in our series, we're going to be discussing an adventure novel, Kidnapped, 1886, by Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And Kidnapped has a plot that seems about as simple as plots get. Young man leaves home to seek his fortune, has a series of dangerous encounters, and then returns to take up his rightful inheritance. But the prose of the novel was admired by no less an authority than Henry James. And complex social and political forces swirl just below the surface. Joining me today to try to unswirl them and get to grips with that prose style are Andrew Hagan, author of 7 novels, most recently Caledonian Road and Mayflies, and the LRB's editor-at-large, and Tom Crewe, author of the novel The New Life and a contributing editor at the LRB, and great Stevenson fans, both of them, I should say. Welcome, Andy and Tom.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, Claire.
So in 1882, a few years before Kidnapped, Stevenson wrote an essay called A Gossip on Romance, which I thought we might begin with. And there he says that reading should be an absorbing and voluptuous experience. We should gloat over a book, be wrapped clean out of ourselves. The words, if the book be eloquent, should run thenceforward in our ears like the noise of breakers. Or the story, if it be a story, repeat itself in 1,000 coloured pictures to the eye. It was for this last pleasure that we read so closely and loved our books so dearly in the bright, troubled period of boyhood. Eloquence and thought, character and conversation were but obstacles to brush aside as we dug blithely after certain sort of incident like a pig for truffles. For my part, I liked a story to begin with an old wayside inn where, towards the close of the year 1700 and X, several gentlemen in 3 cocked hats were playing bowls. Give me a highwayman, and I was full to the brim. A Jacobite would do. So there is Stevenson's 18th century imagination and the seeds of Treasure Island and Kidnapped. Treasure Island begins, I take up my pen in the year of grace 1700 and X and go back to the time when my father kept the Admiral Benbow Inn. And Kidnapped has no inn or gentlemen playing bowls, but it begins in the year 1751 and there are more than a few Jacobites around the place. And you can hear Stevenson the stylist in those lines, that pungent image of the young reader snuffling around like a truffle pig for exciting nuggets of plot. But we also get a glimpse of Stevenson the reader, don't we? This young child for whom books and the coloured pictures of life that they provided were about the most important thing in the world. It was for this last pleasure that we read so closely and loved our books so dearly in the bright, troubled period of boyhood. That bright, troubled period. So Tom, could I start with you and ask you to tell us a little about Stevenson and his background? What kind of childhood and early adulthood did he have?
Well, he was born in 1850 in Edinburgh, a city which always haunted his imagination. His paternal family were famous civil engineers specialising in the construction of lighthouses and harbours. His maternal grandfather was a minister in the Church of Scotland, and his maternal great-grandfather was a professor of moral philosophy at Edinburgh University. So I think we could already almost see a duality there, the outdoorsy man of action and the man of thought and conscience. He had a childhood racked by illnesses, a very kind of troubled childhood with very intermittent schooling. So we can typically see him as someone driven in on himself, on his imagination, which was nourished by a nurse prone to telling ghoulish stories, lots of reading, writing from a very early age, and a famous cut-out theatre, which we can see as presenting those stark images, those individual, brightly coloured images to his imagination. He tried the family business when he reached young adulthood. Even though he really wanted to pursue literature already, he compromised with his father. He was called to the bar in 1875, but he never really practised. He actually went straight back to literature, having already fallen out with his father over the loss of his faith. And then over the next few years, he established himself as an essayist, a travel writer, writer of short stories, and he eventually got his big break with Treasure Island, which was first published in the magazine Young Folks, a boys' magazine, over 81 and 82, but really had its big success when it was published in book form in 1883. And I think it's important to really emphasise that in all this period of early achievement, he was moving all over the place. He was constantly on the move. He was in France, he was in America, Scotland, Switzerland, completed Treasure Island in Davos. And some of this travel was down to his marriage to an American woman, Fanny Osborne, but it was mainly down to his health. He had chronic lung disease and several near-death experiences during this period. He spent much of his time in bed, writing in bed, or in the gaps of health that were allotted him. And it was for health reasons that he moved to Bournemouth in July 1884, and this is where he did some of his major writing, short stories, essays, his great exchange with Henry James on the art of fiction in the second half of 1884, which began an important friendship for them both. And in 1886, he suddenly comes out swinging with one of the great double whammies in the history of literature, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Kidnapped. And Kidnapped, like Treasure Island, was first serialised in Young Folks, in this boys' magazine. He'd begun it in March 1885, broken off, began again in January 1886, and broke off again for good in April 1886 on grounds of health, which explains the curtailed or truncated ending. And actually he picked up the story of David Balfour, the story of Kidnapped, in its sequel, Katrina, which was published in book form in 1893. And by that time, he was living on Samoa, having left Europe for the last time in 1887, and where, while still in a new phase of remarkable literary achievement, he died suddenly in December 1894. So that's a kind of helter-skelter David Balfour and Alan Breck style tramp through Stevenson's life. But 1886 is the year we were given Kidnapped.
So at one point, Stevenson, despite not having been a great student, contemplated an academic career as Professor of History and Law at Edinburgh University. History, Scottish history especially, was an abiding fascination of his. And Kidnapped, which is set in the mid-18th century and involves real historical actors, was the first of his novels in which you see those Scottish interests being worked out. As the resident 18th century nerd here, I thought it was only right and proper that I be the one to take you back 270-odd years to the Highlands, where the novel is set. So we are back in 1751, which is 5 years on from the Battle of Culloden in Inverness, 1746, which is very important because it represented the final clash of the two opposing camps that Stevenson describes in Kidnapped. So there were the Loyalists, in the novel The Whigs, those who supported the British government and the Hanoverian monarchy, and there were the Jacobites, who believed that the Hanoverians shouldn't be on the throne, and instead the descendants of the Stuart royal line, who were in exile in Rome after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they were the rightful rulers and should be restored. And broadly within Scotland, the lowlanders tended to be Loyalists, and Jacobite support largely came from the Highlands. So in 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie, who's the Jacobite claimant to the throne, invaded Britain from the continent. Initially, the invasion went pretty well and was sort of terrified the British, but it was routed 9 months later at Culloden. And the significance of that was that it largely destroyed Jacobitism as a force. So Bonnie Prince Charlie just about managed to escape, but many didn't. Those who did survive were often put on trial for high treason and executed or transported. And the British used the defeat as an opportunity to crush the power of the Highland clans. So clan chiefs who had supported the rebellion lost their estates. Tenants had to relocate, or they went begging. The wearing of clan tartan was banned, as was the owning of weaponry. And there was significant economic hardship and much resentment in these small remaining pockets of resistance. And all of this is very much live in the early 1750s, and it gives us the broad context for Kidnapped. But there's also a specific context. So Andy, could I pass to you to describe what was going on in a small place called Appin in the Western Highlands around this time?
I'm going to do my best through the tears, Claire. You gave such a good account there of this savage difficulties experienced by the Jacobites that I'm murmuring old songs to myself, but I'll get past that and tell you about the Appin murder case. A temporary factor on those forfeited estates, Colin Roy Campbell, nicknamed the Red Fox. In Gaelic, we should remember, Ant Shunnock Ruad. He was a famous person in the news of that year because he was shot dead at Lochaber on the 17th of May, 1752. That estate had been confiscated, as so many were, after the rebellion of 1745. That particular estate belonging to Clan Stewart of Appin, who had been vigorously in support of Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite cause, and were there at Culloden. The killing of the Red Fox was an act of revenge, I suppose, and resistance against the Highland clearances. That's what we're really talking about. This novel's set in the midst of a sort of dismay and almost a sort of civil war in Scotland about the issue of people being cleared off their lands, clans being abolished, as it were, in the old clan system in the Highlands, not only by this point being precarious, but looking to disappear altogether. Now, Stevenson does something very unusual that is quite new to the novel. I mean, we'll talk about the stylistics further in this conversation, but immediately on this issue of using a real case, the Appin murder case. Of course, since the beginning of the novel in English, people had used real experience. I mean, Daniel Defoe's famous account of Robinson Crusoe, well, even at the time, people knew that there had been an Alexander Selkirk who had been shipwrecked and landed on an island. He was the inspiration. And also, much later, with a famous case such as, for example, Flaubert's Madame Bovary, again at the time it was known that there had been a Delphine Delamere who was married to a provincial doctor in Normandy and had an affair and died. These things were common to the novel in all its incarnations, but what was new with Stevenson is not changing the names. You know, that he mixed at the most basic and wonderful level factuality with the purely imagined. So Kidnapped, from the very word go, is a novel that mixes the historical and the imagined. Of course, Walter Scott had tried some of that, and he was much more of a historical novelist in that sense. He set up almost paper-mache figures from history, but often gave them new names, new constructions. This is very striking in Kidnapped, that how is he going to deal with the fact that a real man, Colin Roy Campbell, was shot dead in the circumstances exactly as described, and indeed that a man who was the head of the Stewart clan, James Stewart of the Glens, was then convicted and executed for that killing. And that, of course, is part of the background to this novel, but it becomes a very important feature in the sequel to Kidnapped that I know we'll touch on later, Katrina, published 7 years after Kidnapped. But that judicial killing, as it's now understood, of James Stewart of the Glens, who almost certainly was not responsible for the killing. By folk memory, neither was the hero of Kidnapped either. We find that Alan Breck, although he was the chief suspect in the killing, probably didn't commit it, that he was further off in the heather at the time, although he made himself a prime suspect by having, I don't know if the word's boasted or promised, that he would love to kill this especially hard-faced factor, the Red Fox. But the judicial killing of the head of the clan was almost stage-managed, that the Hanoverians and the government were going to show the Highlanders once again that the killing of officers of the Crown was not going to be tolerated. I should remind listeners that the Circuit Court at Inverary, where the court case took place, was presided over by the Lord Chief Justice General, the Duke of Argyll, and 11, count them, 11 Campbells. That's to say 11 of the Hanoverian enemy on the jury. So I'm afraid old James Stewart of the Glens stood no chance, and he was very summarily executed at Ballachulish, and his bones and body were allowed to hang there for 18 months in chains as a warning to Highlanders and clan members all over Scotland what happened to people who opposed the Crown.
And it's interesting that, isn't it? Because when we first hear of the name of James Stewart in the novel, David says, "This was the first time I heard the name of that James Stewart who was afterwards so famous when he was hanged." And we haven't even met this man yet. But we know that at some future point, which is still in the past, he will be hanged. And there are maybe 3 characters whose hangings are the first thing we know about them.
That's an interesting little bit of technique on Stevenson's part. This is such a technically brilliant book. Stevenson introduces all sorts of new technical, almost filmic, as we would now understand it, techniques to the novel, including that little flash forward that you just mentioned. That was thought to be very wrong and is still. His friend Henry James would disapprove of that, this giving information that he couldn't possibly have had at the time. He's looking back, so it's sort of allowed, but Muriel Spark, when she does that famously at the beginning of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, another Scottish novel full of technique, where she describes the death of one of the young girls at Marcia Blaine's school, when she's only a child. So authorial knowledge is played with here. Our narrator knows more than he seems to know. This relationship, guided by our narrator, David Balfour, is one where he's introducing things that are new to storytelling, quite modernist.
If you're listening on the LRB podcast or on the free version of Close Readings, then I'm afraid we're going to have to leave you there. But if you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear the rest of it, and trust me, there's a lot more of it, you can do that right now by subscribing to Close Readings. And that will give you access to all our other Close Readings series as well, covering literature from ancient Greece to the present day. And you can find details of how to do that in the description or go directly to lrb.me/audio. That's lrb.me/audio.